I am thrilled to see such a large crowd here today, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to this exciting conversation. My name is Laura Brueck, and I'm an associate professor of Hindi and comparative literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at Northwestern. Before I introduce my colleague and our esteemed guest, I want to address a few practical matters. Unless you're speaking up to ask a question when we open up the Q&A, please do keep your mics on mute to safeguard against any interruptions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat function to either type your question or indicate your desire to ask one. For their support of this event, I'd like to thank the Program in Comparative Literary Studies, in particular, Alessia Riccardi, Sarah Peters, and Tom Winters. I'd also like to thank the South Asia Research Forum and the Weinberg College Center for International and Area Studies, in particular, Cindy Pingree and Danny Postal, who've done a terrific job in helping spread the word about this event far and wide. Although I don't think anyone spread it as far and wide as Suraj's single tweet did. That got it a lot farther and wider than any of us were able to do on our own. So thanks for that too, Suraj. Additionally, I want to make two geographically specific acknowledgements, even as we convene virtually today from sites all over the world. The first is Northwestern's land acknowledgement, which is to say that the Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. The second acknowledgement I'd like to make before opening up this conversation is to recognize that as we speak, India is experiencing a devastating COVID crisis. I expect that the vast majority of us here today are worrying about loved ones in India and that our hearts are broken by the needless human tragedy, fueled in large part by existing inequities and incessant political grandstanding that we're witnessing. Our conversation today sits in relief against this difficult backdrop. I come finally now to introductions. I'm very pleased first to introduce Professor Ivy Wilson, my partner today in moderating this conversation. Ivy is an associate professor of English at Northwestern and an affiliate of the Departments of African American Studies and Art Theory and Practice, as well as the programs in African Studies, American Studies, and Asian American Studies. Ivy and I are also the co-directors of the new Race, Caste, and Colorism project at Northwestern, generously supported by the Buffett Institute of Global Affairs. We have a lot of exciting things planned in the years ahead. To stay in touch with us, I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, and I meant to put this in earlier, but I will do it now. I just created this yesterday for this purpose, at RaceCast. So you can follow us on Twitter there to find out all the exciting things that we will be doing in the months and years ahead. And last, but obviously not least, I'm thrilled today to introduce our guest, Dr. Suraj Yengde. Suraj is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and an associate of the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He's the co-editor with Anand Teltumde of The Radical in Ambedkar, Critical Reflections, and the author of the best-selling Caste Matters, which I have here to hold up, but I also see that it's behind him on his bookshelf, so that's helpful. Published in 2019, which in a review in The Hindu, G. Sampath describes as, quote, a powerful polemic that marshals elements of traditional philosophical inquiry, memoir, history, social anthropology, and cultural studies to activate a dialogical narrative primed for a singular agenda, to shift the framework of conversations about caste from something that happens to Dalit Bahujans, such as reservations and atrocities, to something that upper castes preserve and benefit from, but rarely acknowledge. Suraj is an extraordinarily prolific contributor to publications such as The Caravan, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and the Huffington Post, among other outlets. His is an innovative, outspoken, and impassioned voice for building solidarities between anti-racist and anti-casteist movements to dismantle interconnected regimes of social oppression. His July 2020 essay in the Caravan, The Harvest of Casteism, Race, Caste, and What It Will Take to Make Dalit Lives Matter, pre-circulated before our conversation today and linked, or soon to be linked, I think, in the chat, serves as a radical new intervention on the long-standing question of the intersectionality of Dalit and Black lives that previously animated social justice leaders of the 20th century, like Jyotirao Phule, Bhimrao Ambedkar, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King Jr. I'll turn it over now to Suraj, who will speak briefly about the current exigencies of the contemporary intersections of Dalit and Black lives before opening it up to a broader conversation. Suraj, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Laura. I am really excited and grateful. I was already very excited when I received an email from you, and I've been much looking forward to this conversation. I just want to acknowledge and salute your work in Dalit literature for the immense contribution you have been in the vast net of expanse of Dalit literature. You have really made a name which will remain for a longer time, not least for your translation, but also for working through the genre so eloquently that people like me read and learn and continue to learn more about theory as well as the experiences of writing. So I appreciate you for that work. And it's not new, it's been for a while. So it's not coming out of a need-based, but it's been something that has been recorded for long. I will want to extend my gratitude to Brother Ivy Wilson, who I look forward to having more conversations today and that will follow. And congratulations to both of you for winning the project. I am just as excited as you are. Gratitude also to Cindy and Tom for helping us organize this, and to all the people whose name I may not be able to mention, but my gratitude and appreciation is extended to you too. And also to the two acknowledgements that Laura mentioned. I want to also echo those. And as we work on today's concept of working through the Dalit and Black lives, and some of you might know I've been trying to work with this concept for some time now, and I've been trying my best to create a archive for the future. We have already developed a robust archive from as early as 1820s, especially in America. And many people know about Jyotirao Phule's text, Gulamgiri, slavery, dedicated to the abolitionists, mostly in the New England area. Jyotirao Phule himself, living in Western Maharashtra, under especially the Scottish influence, which again, Western Maharashtra was more attuned almost in a rejection to colonial British Anglo sphere than to going to American Anglo sphere, and the curriculum that was present was very much rooted in American tradition. So they had read the biography of George Washington to Thomas Paine, and the work that was happening in that regard. And it's fascinating that during 1870s and even 60s, the migration of ideas and translation of the action was reported from America to India, mostly Western India. And it's almost this kinetic force from Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, connecting this very much in its hypothesis, which becomes actualized eventually now, much later, 150 years in counting. And I think I sit in that tradition, trying to then revive the 150-year-old rich tradition that has been archived, but also many times that has not been recorded, because the oppressed, as the politics of archiving goes and record goes, will have to always rely on the oppressor, and the oppressor is not invested in the liberation of oppressed. And so the citation, even the footnote, the pleasure of even being in the footnote, is not given to the subaltern Dalit sphere or anti-caste sphere in this sense. We know the story of from India to America, but there is much more from America to India, and so we need to acknowledge how both geographies gratefully helped each other without really actually telling them that this was our project. They were really creating these telos. They were creating linear as well as equatorial archives that worked across the plane, which was helpful not only for helping the movements, but also for the oppressors to know that we are watching you. And it was a very much big brother but in a loving big brother way, as opposed to the oppressor big brother fashion that we see. The force of media, especially newspapers, journals, the extensive reportage sent from India to America by the American press remains a rich reservoir of the history of race and caste, in this case, Dalit and Black. Now, granted, when the struggle or when the reporting of these issues were happening, it was not always concerning Dalit and Black as we talked about it in present day context. But the precursor to what we talk about today has somehow ideas almost in an embryonic phase been given a rise during the mid-19th century. There are three important actors that might help us to anchor American side. One certainly is an amazing work by one gentleman named Roberts. Roberts was a Christian missionary who wrote a text, Caste Opposed to Christianity, 1849. And this text really brings about the legacy of how caste is not just rooted within the social dynamics, but it is very much a part of what we talk as a theological perspective. The text, pardon me, I said 1848 was 1847, and this text really brought out the subtle nuances as to how caste was not just existing in the political economy, but very much part of a Hindu social order. And that argument was forcefully made by preacher Roberts. The full text is cast in, and we are talking about 1847. Title is certainly has to be self-explanatory than what we have in monosyllables as we usually do. The title goes as Caste in its religious and civil character, comma, opposed to Christianity. And the Reverend Joseph Roberts goes about documenting existence of caste from 1820s to 1840s, almost 20 years of research has been put into it, and given that the major wave of conversion that were happening to Christianity was something that could potentially challenge the caste-based order, but the history of that doesn't remain confined. One important, rather more radical figure of his times is the Massachusetts-based lawyer and senator Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner is an abolitionist, takes this concepts of Reverend Joseph Roberts and doesn't just take it and runs with it in many directions, in many phases, and the contribution of him, of course, famous text, The Question of Caste, but also Sumner is more devoted to understanding what is the condition of the Shudra and the Pariah, which is the lower caste, as well as the present-day untouchables or the Dalits. And this is in comparison, certainly, with the slavery. Now, these are white people. Two important Black people of the era, the grand old Frederick Douglass, uplifts the narrative of caste in his rhetorical best, but also in his scathing polemic. Douglass is not just concerned with, as we know, Douglass is trying to reconstruct America, and much of his reconstruction is doing with dealing with the idea of constitution and the executive powers. So in his famous speech called "Citizen and the Spirit of Caste," Citizenship and the Spirit of Caste, which was delivered in 1858, this really looks at how slavery is a manifestation of the extension of the racial caste system. He doesn't call it racial caste system. He literally calls it the cruel and malignant spirit of caste, which is where there is an exclusion of a colored people from a quotidian regular life, but also public accessibility, be it railway carriages. And we are talking about pre-Jim Crow era, which was existing in actual Jim Crow. This is basically, we're talking about post-bellum, even antebellum in this case, era. Now, Douglass is not just concerned about the idea of caste in this case, but Douglass is also trying to argue that slavery had this particular essence, very much in Hegelian, the spirit of caste. the Hegelian idea of spirit of caste is where Douglas is observing the cardinal sin of how we look at slavery. And why is caste essentially describing slavery? Because caste is foundation, according to Douglas, to what we see the edifice of slavery. Another important Black person of the era who actually wrote before Frederick Douglass delivered that speech, 1855, his autobiography, the first African-American medical degree holder, James McKean Smith, who writes his autobiography, again, lengthy title, but here it is, My Bondage and My Freedom. In that, McKean Smith argues, and he says, caste is the chief minister to the sustainability of slavery, end quote. This is what he's bringing out the essence of how caste, to understand caste, is basically to deal with the hereditary structures. And in this case, the idea of American drawback or backwardness, Smith argues, has to do with the centrality of caste. And as we see, caste is observed, or in this case, racial caste is observed as a direct outcome of slavery. It's an offshoot at times, but it works alongside what we have what we call the institution of slavery. It eventually becomes identified as racial caste to give a designation to social system, but also to the racist structures that were really biologizing the essence and differences of two totally separate but clearly united concepts. Now, the question remains, the idea of caste became so pertinent for the audiences in America, especially abolitionist, anti-slavery audiences, abolitionists and radicals, because the Brahminism that existed in the form of Hinduism, which was existing in its pure form, had those exercising of hereditary and hierarchical distinctions, which was very much present with the influx of Europeans who came and established a slave system. And this is what interested the abolitionists, but also the people who institutionalized slavery. So there was an essence, there was a knowledge, there was a spread of information, especially when you're talking about 17th century, when newly discovered texts, especially the Western world, German in this case, and we all know Hegel and Berkeley and all dealt with the question of Hinduism or the religion of India, and in extension also with the idea of caste and the labor whose dignity was tarnished under the rubric of karma, but also to the descent-based, the lineage-based discrimination. And so it is in this sense, it was very important for the lawmakers of slavery, but also the lawmakers of slavery laws, especially after the Nat Turner's rebellion, which was really crushed, and the outcome of that was very much to bring a new, much more robust form of Manu's law in a way. They didn't identify it as Manu's law, but if you look at through the kind of repugnant legislations and the injunction that were imposed upon any freedom seeking or even thinking was conditioned and confined. In this case, you could not just act, but also your thought was then publicly lynched. This is what the Brahminic caste system exercised for more than 2.5 millennia. The public flogging as well as lynching was a demonstration to retain the caste structure. Lynching that we see in America in its own gory form, in India did, but it was not documented. There was no I.W. Wells to go and record that part of history, because I.W. Wells, like educated people, as there were very few in America, in India, there were almost none. That's why Phule becomes important, and then Ambedkar, the ultimate archivist and recorder of untouchables' horrors as well as stories. So in a way, Ambedkar becomes the I.W. Wells, he becomes the W.E.B. Du Bois, he also becomes Charles Sumner, Frederick Douglass, and Reverend Roberts, to the condition of caste slavery of untouchables in India's Brahminic system.
Thank you so much, Suraj. I think that we'll start out with a conversation with And Ivy, if you're willing,
Yeah.
I'll kick it over to you for question number one.
Yeah, thank you, Suraj. That was, do you have notes in front of you? Are you reading off a screen? Because that's more than impressive here. I was taking a little kind of intimidated because I scribbled a bunch of notes and prepared comments, but I think I might want to just begin with the last thing you said about Becker being Sumner and Douglas, and just hover a little bit more on Ida B. Wells, who is an important social activist at the turn of the 19th century, and it's difficult not to recognize her importance here in Chicago, given the ways in which she was on the periphery of the Chicago's World Fair in 1893, asking its organizers why the American Negro wasn't involved in a celebration about essentially Western modernity. But the part that I think is even more interesting in terms of the connections you are intimating here is Ida B. Wells' Red Record, which is an archive documenting the numerous times in which African Americans were lynched, and I'm curious about what you see in Wells as an activist, and how what you were calling earlier the necessity of, quote, creating an archive of the future. So and think about Wells's relationship as an archivist, as she's also trying to mobilize a certain notion of political activism.
Thank you. Shall I? Oh yeah, okay. I should respond. Thank you so much for this question, Ivy. I think in many ways, the story of Ida B. Wells here is, someone who is really born into slavery, and then gets freed and participates in this fascinating journey of her life. I mean, her life is many people, I think, unfortunately, and even in India, among Dalits also, they don't know the story of Ida B. Wells. I did not know until I really came to Harvard and spent time at the African American Center to really grapple her story. Her personal life certainly is inspiration, but what she really does, and definitely Chicago is very much central to what much of she is doing. But she just doesn't, she is a woman, goes into a space of potential lynching, as someone who could be subjected to something that she's reporting, and does so courageously and so eloquently that it really gives an ammunition for next generation African Americans, or even the generation of African Americans that were contemporary, to really take on that work and go into directions that I'm sure she had hoped. And I think in the Indian context, that's why when I mentioned Ambedkar had that essence of it, which was scholarship was meant to not only give wheels to ideas, but he really wanted you to also take whatever armaments you could and go and fight. Don't just argue or don't just go with anywhere. You gotta take it head on, and it's very much this radical proclamation that gets theorized in his life, and so but Ambedkar remains, unlike Ida B. Wells or others, remains an unacknowledged by the so-called public sphere, or also he doesn't get the trophies and the medallions for his work. He doesn't get Pulitzer Prize, of course. Not that his work is comparable to other Pulitzer, but the point is the work he puts in to really usher in a new sense of identity and confidence in these people, which is why we had nobody. Of course, there were people writing in different languages, not in English language. And so the unifying language of then era, because India's complex structure doesn't really allow you to. And I always wondered, if United States, each state had its own language like India, what would United States be looking like, and what would the African American struggle, be? Would they communicate in Telugu and Marathi with each other? How would they really resolve the conflict? Because Southern is a different, and And I think one of the advantage African Americans had in compared to the revolutionary struggle of Dalit was the universal language that they really opted on. And there is a politics of that as well, which goes again, it takes us into a separate space. But this is what is necessitating me to really bring back those heroes and sheroes to our current times, and to really give them their due. India has given, the world has not, and maybe it's about time that some of these comes in comparison. And I think the best way to bring their work is to put them alongside each other as a sweet complementary concept.
So I really admire this notion of a suite of complements, or the logic of analogy. And I'm wondering about how the overlapping histories that resulted in the kind of collapse of the British Empire has made near kinfolk of people spread throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not coincidental then that, perhaps it might not be coincidental, that certain notions where certain political structures where color and colorism animate a certain kind of bureaucracy can therefore find kinfolk, both in terms of how they're thinking about lobbying for political liberation on the one hand, but also suturing, if you will, a kind of oppressive system. So in the case that you've outlined in your talk today around Du Bois or Douglas as kind of African-American interlocutors, if you will.
Yeah.
It's also the case that, for example, in South Africa, the kind of apartheid regime mobilized and structured the 20th century definition based on a form of Jim Crow. So I'm wondering about the kind of function or place of the world system in your kind of thought process here, and how different forms of economics or politics move or circulate or deploy color in different kinds of ways to support a given polity.
Thank you for asking. And I think, some of us really should brave these borders, because I think unless and until we task ourselves to critically examine, the concepts and ideas that we really carry on still today, and in a way, it gets rejected. Marxists have a different reading, the pacifists have, you know what I mean, but the operation remains same. You might call it whatever you want. You might want to use a different measurement to assess the condition, but the subjectivity of oppressed and their condition has not altered, whatever or whichever angle we might attempt to do. In a way, as you were very rightly, the Jim Crow era definitions really get spilled over and become like the notion of empire across, and very much American empire is there, but it's a silent player as much, not as compared to British Empire. One of the limitation of that was, when we understand race, we usually, or color, it's usually Americanized notion of understanding color, and that's why the difficulty, even in the African National Congress, the kind of pantheons of African struggle in South Africa, at least, John Dube, but also there are people who are not only part of the regime, but because of course there were some Africans who were working with the state, not apartheid yet, trying to find solutions, like Zuma, who was the founder of African National Congress. And so what we see is that they are also very much kind of looking at America as to what's happening, and by the force of the American export, there were certain ideas that remain accepted, and there were some ideas that really remain, in a way, rejected. Like, for example, Senghor, in the francophone African context, he really the negritude really comes out in its own concept, and takes to a different, goes back to, of course, Caribbean, but also French and the West African part, which had its own, and which had its own different stories, and Fanon, of course, kind of works through the archive. Interesting is Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, is also wrestling with this concept. So how do we then create a global framework for all to have kind of similar language, if not mono language? And I think the similarities are so much that we can even develop a kind of a new language that could put us in conversation with each other, as opposed to contesting against each other, or as opposed to pitting, or what I mean. We need a complementary dialectics, and I think these complementary dialectical concepts could very much be part of history, but also part of something that we're not in history. And I think caste, in a way, had that enigma that was very much prevalent in America, and we can call it racial caste, which then became very much, and somehow by 1940s it gets subsumed by the American School of Sociology, especially the University of Chicago departments, and it gets obscured. There are many reasons for that, but I think in the 21st century, now the struggle remains same. We are looking at the same pessimistic black hole, which is using the 19th and 20th century blue paper to inflict similar type of harms. Today it's called neoliberal dragnet that is very intimately tied to indigenous cultures, and it goes vast way. So I think if we can develop the idea of origin, not as an origin as a community of origin, but origin as an originality, and this originality does not need to rely on European concepts of 19th century. We need to break these concepts, and if we are willing to redefine our humanity, I think one of the start is not just decolonizing, but also refusing the idea of new extraterrestrial colonization by the Musks and the Bransons of the world. And I think that's what would tie us, because we are planetary communities, not really tied by the arbitrary inhumane borders, literally confining us to the status of animals.
I wonder if I could just ask you one more question before I pass it on to Laura. You're getting mad respect in the chat, which I don't know if you can see right now, but just to kind of buttonhole this, the conversation between caste in India and slavery in the US, you noted that James McKean Smith had noted that caste sustains slavery, right? And you had mentioned as a rejoinder that caste is a dialectic of slavery. And I wanted, just as we move a little bit more into the contemporary, if you could speak about how caste sustains capitalism, or that how caste sustains certain notions of political inequality. But in particular, I'm thinking about the question of capitalism and the economic world system of this contemporary moment of globalization, and even more particularly what's been in the headlines a great deal recently around caste and Silicon Valley and tech companies. And so moving the object of study away from the 19th century and slavery per se, but to the modern world of the now with globalization, capitalism, and the like.
I mean, this is just a call for action. Literally, you're just asking me what can we know, and I like that question. And I think we can intellectualize this as well. So point is, caste has managed to give a lifeline for capitalism, and this lifeline is predicated on it's almost like for capitalism to survive, caste has to exist, and for caste to survive, capitalism has to exist. They are very much, they are so intimately tied that we might even miss out identifying, and that's why in contemporary context, the neoliberal regime has made us busy to fight the petty wars of woke culture induced micro struggles. Now, granted that struggles at each level are important, but the neoliberal net is so strong, the blanket has been so smoothing that the radical opponents of this new regime has managed to create more pores into the already inflating bubble caste, and we are really faced with this question as to is caste only relating to the concepts of social, or does it have the possibility of being a demos, which is political, and the economic notion of caste? And I think it very much effectively sits, because the idea of caste is tight control of human labor. And wherever control of human labor comes, we all know the drill, surplus becomes the central component, and that gives rise to the multitude of exploitation. But the peculiar aspect of caste is the protest against capitalism doesn't come as strongly, because the protest is against the immediate oppressor, which is not even the one who's oppressing, is just a middleman or middle woman, whoever the middle person is. So what we need to do is we need to eject the anodyne respectability of caste, and to make it a tool to not only target, and that's what I've been constantly telling people. The struggle against caste is not just a struggle to gain a position. It's not a diversity quota competition. It's actually trying to really subvert the structure, and really subverting the structure from the vision and lens and experience of the oppressed. And oppressed has certain demands. They might not necessarily be taught in the university spaces. Neither the subaltern studies and decolonization projects have even managed to attain, because people like me were not there. But the future of caste and capitalism will only exist if we will not understand its dangerous locus in our life. And for me to really think about the detrimental aspects of capitalism is to tie it to the originality of capitalism, which is really destroying the echo chamber that we're living, and eco in the sense really in the climate change, the climate damage politics, but also the losing standards of basic life. Dalits in this case stand much to lose, because their overall dependence, and this applies to whoever is relying on natural resources for their survival for several generations, are someone who are dealing in a system of hereditary. They're dealing in the system of following a certain status quo. That capitalism is really snatching away from them. And as I said, these billionaires are happy to take special flights if there is a COVID regulation in UK, and go to India. And as soon as India gets COVID, they are willing to take special flights and go to UK. There is certainly the caste privileges of the Banyas or Brahmins in our context, who use caste to advantage themselves, but will use class lens to hide the privileges that they draw, which gets back to their original identity, the womb that gave them the character of caste.
Thank you, Suraj.
So I have just maybe one or two questions before, I definitely want to give everyone who's here and who is writing very enthusiastically in the chat a chance to ask questions as well. But Suraj, I want to come back to something that you just said in response to Ivy's second question that I wrote down and circled and starred, but about creating a global language and a complementary dialectics of a discourse around caste and color and race that we can, that translates right across borders. And that makes me want to quote you back to yourself from your book, from Caste Matters. So I have something here that I had already sort of previously noted down that I wanted to talk about that I think resonates with that. And this is the part of your book in which you talk about Dalit universalism, right? And you say, quote, Dalit universalism locates the self beyond and outside the peripheral universality, beyond the peripheral identities that seek to prioritize their identities over other hegemonic orders. The emergence of the third world, global south, or other modernist-centered logos of humanity is premised on the uniqueness and exclusivity of identities. These appeal for a self-imposed isolation, whereas Dalit universalism appeals for a common humanism, a collective of everyone as human beings and access to a universal vision of humanity. A compassionate form of maitri, or fellowship, informs the humanist tradition that underscores Dalitness. And so I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about whether this idea of humanistic universalism, or this idea that you just brought up about creating a global language, or finding, a sort of set of complementary dialectics, if this is something that transcends the promise and maybe also the pitfalls of political solidarities, and sort of how you understand the difference between those two things. And also, how do we bring this about? Like, how do we, Dalit universalism demands an annihilation of caste hierarchies. What does Dalit universalism demand transnationally or planetarily? And how do we do that? What does Dalit universalism mean outside of a caste context? Or maybe we can't, or maybe there is no outside of a caste context. Maybe that's part of it, that we're, the whole world is in a caste context in some way. And then I'm just curious, I'll just give you everything right now. And then I'm interested in how, the role of literature and art and aesthetic representation, and what kind of, when I was playing with the title of this presentation, obviously I was playing off Caste Matters, and I came up and everyone in my class who read your book, we were really compelled with your conversation around Dalit humanity, and so it became Humanity Matters. But then from sitting here as a literature professor in university, I was starting, and in the ever-present sort of position of precariousness that the humanities now reside in university settings, I was thinking about humanities matter, and then I was like, oh no, that's a little too cute, I'm not going to do that. But anyway, I'm curious about how all of these things work together for you in thinking about Dalit universalism, a global dialectic of caste and color.
Thank you, Laura. I think I was really itching to comment on art, and I think that really remains a ignored subset in the struggle, and especially conversational and this Dalit universalism, or even in this kind of a progress of humanity through solidarity, and I call it sibling solidarity, and it's in a way non-gendered, non-hierarchical, very much rooted in first-person respectability, which grants a certain agency to either side based on a very fragile vulnerability of both. I've been thinking, the limitations of that. I think there is a lot of pettiness that has managed to be entertained in the circles who are demanding a certain language of freedom or liberation. What I mean by that is, we have conditioned our next goals to immediate needs, than next goal being tied to a broader vision. And broader vision doesn't get you an answer, 1 + 1 = 2. It has to be 1 + 1 = 11 to kind of find the endless possibilities of what is there between 2 and 11. There is nine different phases of our life, or struggles or structures. And in this sense, when I argue with Dalit universalism, when I say annihilation of caste, I don't condition it to in domesticity of caste. I really bring out, the phrases of how caste is rooted and understood across the world. I mean, Africa. There's a paper that's going to come out. I just wrote Global Caste. That global caste is kind of bringing out a new dialogue about caste existing in different societies. Now, many a times we have identified it in different ways. It doesn't matter to me. You call it caste or you don't call it caste. But what remains structure is annihilation of something, not adjustment into something, or not ameliorating it, or not amending it. We need to annihilate it, because we can't really have a dialogue based on something that is going to it's like those amoebas. It's going to take a different shape, different form, and come to life again and again. And for that to really take place, as I even argue, that it is based on the idea of fellowship, maitri, friendship. And we've been, I've been telling, we need friendship conferences of people from different solidarities. Let's talk about, and this friendship is rooted in Buddha, but also in Kabir's idea of friendship. Kabir's idea of friendship is so fluid, is so fantastic, is so non-binding. As long as Kabir says, you can hold my hand, walk with me, you are my friend. That's it. There's nothing much invested in here. It's a motion of our own common purpose. And as Ivy asked, very important question about capitalism. This is really the fear that we are seeing. And we know, what the neoliberal order has managed to co-opt much of this rebel language by really altering this into adjusting, by creating an inclusion framework, by creating a more diverse faces framework. It has managed to. And you might be, who knows, 20 years, 30 years down the line, humanities department will even exist. There might just be people who are, writing magazine articles and just living off that. Even that will be very much, subsidized by, major donors. And this is really trying to, create a threat and intimidation into new. And that's why we need to join forces. We can't let the oppressors have everything say by themselves. I want, in my discourse and vision of future of Dalits, that other oppressed groups become part of me. And we are not worried about resources as of now. But we are the richest people as long as we just know who is exploiting us in what ways. We'll kick in the butt, pardon my French, of the people who are just not exploiting the Adanis in India, but going and exploiting the land in the indigenous people of Australia or East Africa, or the kind of extraneous colonization of the Indian Bania capital is at your face. Guptas were at one point, even now, the ruling class of, and literal ruling class, immigrant Guptas, ruling class of South Africa. They were almost having the African National Congress in their pockets. This is what we are afraid of. This is what we are talking about. And that's when I say annihilation of caste, I mean to say those structures that really makes one feel that they own this world. They can create rules for this world, and they can use the same formula they have been using in some geographies and deploy it for their own, tricky natures. And here's the thing. It's not just the CIA or the M6, but there are other global South regimes who are participating in it. And we see that. We see the descent that's happening. Modi becomes a new avatar of 21st century whatnot. And there is a similar form of refusal that's happening. And I think that's why the wonderful canvas of art and humanity, I think the solid framework of our solidarity can begin with these two canons, with sharing of literature, with sharing of, this whole idea of language, as I was talking about. This language, as you know, is not rooted in phonetics or in certain accents, but it is rooted in the purpose. What is our purpose to achieve? And if we solidify that, America remains immune from International Criminal Court, when in fact it continues to unleash genocidal violence upon its own Black citizens. Recently, a report was commissioned by professors and lawyers and jurists, who 188-page report, look up. They say that America should be held accountable to International Criminal Court. Same happens with India. Not a signatory, again, follows the same model and doesn't even flinch an eye or even attempt to argue against, because they know how fragile it is. So how do we remove these markers is now in this era where people like me, people like you, people like Ivy, and we are all there. We need to now think and decide a program of the future. And that program of the future is not in a cynical sense, but it really means creating concrete programs, establishing concrete initiatives that will take shape in many forms. And of course, art of any form will be our guidance for the blinded beliefs that we have in this.
Thank you. I want to make sure that other people have time to ask questions. So even though I just want you to see how many questions that I have for you that I'm not asking right now, because I want to turn it over to other people who are here. So there are, I see a couple of questions emerging in the chat. And so I do really want to invite everyone to use the chat to articulate a question or to just let us know if you have one, and we'll call on you to ask that question. And as you're doing that, I did want to make sure that a handful of students from my class, my current class on race and caste that is so well versed in your work, had a moment to ask you some questions. So I am gonna pass this off to Akash. And Akash, if you're out there, I'm gonna have you ask the first one.
Hey, thanks, Professor Brueck. Thank you, Dr. Yengde, for being here. This is really great. The question I wanted to ask, I think you have spoken a little bit too, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the interplay between caste and Hindu nationalism in India, and also kind of caste and Indian Americans' kind of attitudes towards Hindu nationalism in the diaspora context. Yeah.
Thank you, Akash. I was just looking through chat, so I just want to give a shout out to my Nandedian who logged in. By the way, I don't know what time it is in India, but Shivaji Pitlewar, thank you for joining in, and also I want to thank John Pinsign, who's kindly, great friend, is doing this. Akash, on the question of diaspora, I think it's as old as the question of Indian immigration. And we know Nico Slate has done excellent work. I encourage you all to read his book. It's just behind, it's called it's called Colored Cosmopolitanism, which really brings out those stories of the diasporic nature of caste and how it conditions and how it gets adjusted into this. In contemporary times, let me just briefly talk about, even Ivy touched on the question of caste in tech industry and how it is taking shape in our times. I think more voices are getting heard. 1970s era that I do research on, especially the Dalit diaspora in America, there is similar type of protest, but there is no social media, and the hostile media doesn't report and represent. So I think the notice and the decibel of this protest has exponentially increased in past 20 years, even now, and that has really brought. But another thing has been the rise of fanatic Hindu-based Hindutva has really gotten into tight grips with the ruling elites of the past government led by Trump, and it was so open that one didn't even have to draw any analogies and make any certain references. And I think these both have contributed into kind of a solidarity work, not only with Dalits, but also other progressive, not only South Asians, but people across the demography, kind of expressing their keen interest. NPR doing a whole segment on this, trying to get sense, and with the case law in California, I think it's going to be a huge change maker. But again, let me tell you, the people with resources and unworthy emotions and very much terrorizing tears have utilized that emotion to undermine the cause of the because the people who should be actually heard are being bullied and silenced, and the people with resources and much more a hands-on technique to deal with white fragility, especially the talking about Robin DiAngelo, but especially through South Asian context, what we see is they have utilized that framework to create more voice. And I think, Akash, what we need to do perhaps is to start pushing back on that narrative, not as a pushback just because we disagree, but pushback as a conversation. Can we have conversation? I mean, yesterday, the Hindu American Foundation tweeted, and people are tagging me, that there is no such thing as Brahminism. So the idea of whole negation, it's like we are the purest form, and this is just a comedic part. But here's the thing: you and I might laugh or smile or smirk, but they are doing at certain work. It's the state-sponsored extension of a cultural diplomacy of a certain. And again, this is not just relating to Hindu; it's also relating to the gurudwaras dominated by Jats, who are responsible again for not promoting the cause of anti-caste struggles. And same happens with the Indian Muslim mosques. Their organizations have been really shabby and downtrodden when it comes to dealing or confronting the question of caste. So we need to push back on this deferential rules of these bodies. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Yengde.
Okay, next, let's go to Melissa Perry.
Hello. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We really loved your book in class, and a question we kind of talked about is we were curious of when you kind of started developing interest in kind of the history of Black activism within the US, and what exactly about those histories kind of resonated with you as a scholar.
Could you maybe reframe that question, Belis, or maybe just repeat?
Yeah, so we were wondering exactly when did you first develop an interest in kind of the history of Black activism within the US, and what about those histories resonated with you?
Okay, autobiographical, I like it. You know, my father was a Dalit Panther. We had a Dalit Panthers in India in mid 1970s. And my dad was part of the Dalit Panthers movement, and I grew up under that kind of tradition. And it was mostly a literary movement. Many people don't know that it was a literature-based movement. And the founders were good friends with my father. One of them is still alive, and I was named by one of the founders of the Dalit Panthers. My name was given by them, so it was there. You know, it was in a way directly, indirectly part of it. But I was exposed to the Black culture, not necessarily USA, but African culture. You know, we had a, you know, and there was certain kind of a, you know, affinity to, you know, what they were doing, what we were doing. But it became more, you know, as you might all know, I went to South Africa to actually do my PhD. And that's where, you know, it kind of started cementing much and more interest, because also it has to do with me trying to fix, as I was started my lecture with, trying to, you know, build up upon the 150-year-old archive, and you know, just to give justice to what is done, but also to create more and more. And I think that's how it started. And frankly, you know, there is much more love in the Black American space. There is much more appreciation. There is much more camaraderie, brotherliness that I feel at home. That, you know, I can criticize, I can work, you know, get, you know, kind of pushback. And I've had this amazing set of mentors. Cornel West, Kip Gates, Khalil Muhammad. These are the people in the field who I work with, you know, rub my shoulder with, bang my ideas with. And it's just being, you know, and in Africa, I work with Achille Mbembe. So it's just this, you know, new form of thought. And as you can see, I'm trying to put this in this conversation. So it's just a lovable process. It's just a, simply put, I feel much at ease and comfort to deal with these spaces within, especially the Black American academia and as well as culture.
Okay, and then I think next is going to be Nicole, and then I'm going to move over to the chat. And so after Nicole, Divya Chandru, I will invite you to ask a question.
Hello, Dr. Yengde. Thank you so much for being here today. That really means a lot, and I'm sure my classmates would agree with that. I guess my question does relate to the last part of your answer. So it's more on the side of academia. Like what are some of the challenges of communicating matters of caste to non-Dalits? And for example, we discussed a lot of the criticism of Wilkerson's book Caste for like overlooking a lot of the contextualization of caste. And I'm just thinking, like, what are some of the things that could be done differently in academia, whether it's the mode of the comparative approach or really anything else?
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for the warm appreciation and welcome to your class. I think academia should de-Brahminize itself. There are too many Brahmins writing on critiquing Wilkerson. I wrote a review of Wilkerson's book as well, and I didn't find those critiques that they find, because I think the purpose of scholarship needs to find options to work with than deny the possibility of some work. You see, if you deal with a terrain that is so old, so unrecorded, and so disparate, so spread across in different time zones, writing that in one book is really, you know, you really need to be Gunnar Myrdal to write, you know, the American Dilemma. kind of a multi-pronged scholarship. So I think explaining caste to others, and that's why this piece will come out. This is an academic long length piece called Global Caste. Is that I try to give those glossaries of what caste means. See, in India, it becomes Brahminized caste system, or in modern sense, Hinduized. In certain, it's a tribalized form of caste system. In certain, it's ethnicized. In some countries, it's racialized. So you go to Latin America, right? The larger scope of even Central America, much of that study has not happened in that context. Now, I don't know how to read Spanish. There must be, but I've read some books, especially about mestizaje caste system in that region, and you can literally see there exists a system. And guess what? The British, as much as it's like such a mixture of European blood that one doesn't know what Saxon is. What is that? That's this intermixing of various castes trying to establish their hegemony. So British, in a way, are themselves multiple mix. They don't have one origin. Danes, Normans, Romans, and they eventually, try to purify caste. It's comedic. It's almost like I'm insecure about you, so let me just throw my insecurities upon you. And that's what the comedic nature of British Empire was, because the ruling class of Britain, especially the southeast part of London, who was ruling, and these were a bunch of Normans, the kids of French colonizers in Britain. So what we see is this definitive notion of caste, also in the German part, Max Muller and others are really redefining caste. And a caste basically is hierarchy, hereditary based system. That was the keynote explanation Sumner offered, that even Douglas carried forward and got recognized. Wilkerson's text is a welcome addition to this comparative work, and of course, there have been critiques by African American scholars, and that those are mostly Marxist critiques. Marxists are never satisfied with a non-structuralist argument. They will always critique that, and there is a certain sense of a bullying of if you don't agree with that notion of ideas, and that happens, because there is a moral superiority of. And Oliver Cox was one of the liabilities in this debate, and so we need to call out those ideas as well. But again, the rich history of caste struggle in racialized context and non-racialized context is pertinent. That's why how do we make sense of racialization in Africa when there exists hierarchy, when there exists a system that is tied to blood and lineage based order? There's got to be some explanation to that. You can't just talk it as a tribal culture or ethnicization. It's much more older than the modern, recently Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a book, Neither Settler Nor Native, is just out. It's basically critiquing the political foundations of how political state is existing. And by the way, race and caste have a same timeline, and they emerge around the same as a European concept. Just FYI. So there's a lot that I can I can theorize on that, but I'll keep that suspense for another time where we'll discuss at length about this Iberian concepts of these ideas.
Well, listen, that other time will be recurrent. We'd love to have you back here more often at Northwestern, on campus, virtually, or physically, as it were. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I can just cue. They're queuing up right now, and I just want to go back to one that was offered about 30 minutes ago. And this comes from Martha Chandran Dickerson, who wants to ask you: can we expect caste to become a protected class in American society, particularly with the language of Hinduphobia becoming more and more prevalent?
See, you can be Hinduphobia if there is an established notion of Hindu-ness. There is no one sense of Hindu-ness, because there cannot be one sense of Hindu-ness, because there are 6,500 castes. How can these many divided groups have one sense of oneness to really develop the idea of phobia? This needs to be clearly understood and broken. Yes, I agree with Martha's proposition that caste needs to be protected category. You know why it needs to be protected category? Because it is also an American problem. If you don't address it, and it's not just going to affect, and I was telling the attorneys in the case that don't just make it a South Asia thing. It's beyond South Asia thing. And and that's why we got Nigerians talk about the caste system that exists within Nigerian context. And you know, there is just so many groups that exist. So yes, caste needs to be a protected category. And once it's protected, then not only we can protect the people who will be oppressed or who will be tortured because there is no exactation of protest for this, but also we can then utilize to advance a global justice to other caste oppressed people. This is the agenda. That's what I'm saying. The American empire needs to be disciplined, and it can be disciplined by bringing these subaltern notions, not by advancing its capitalist interest in the economies that serve ruling class, the what they call Boston Brahmins of America. There is certain peculiarity, and for that to happen, we need to push dialogues of these subaltern notions like caste, so we can then work around. And by the way, that happens in America. Similarly, will happen in other parts of the world, and that's what I was saying. Kind of us creating a language of this sibling solidarity.
Thank you. Martha, the person who asked that question, is throwing all kinds of fire at you right now as well in the kind of emoji tab. So I want to follow up with another question from Prachi Jha, who's asking you who wants to ask a question about the context of the British. And I put that quote in here where you said a moment ago that the British are essentially a mixture of various castes trying to establish themselves as hegemony. And their earlier question that came from around 5 o'clock is, it said that the British perfected and inculcated the caste system in India. And they would like to know your views on this, since it's only ignorance, the ignorance of the upper classes, to obfuscate the truth. Do you have any?
Yeah, I just had a quick response. Yes, British certainly perfected it. Any administrator would need a demarcation of their subjects, and there was already a system that was existing in this form. One of the things to really critically, I always think, is like 400-year history of America. Like peasants from Europe come to America and still, in spite of the slave economy, remain in the same class order with very few kind of ascending to it. What's happening here? One might talk about that all of a sudden, there was, and there was rule. I guess there was some point like some European country, when they came to America, 300 acre was offered to just kind of go and extend colonization. That's basically creating a solid foundation for caste structure. Once you own the resources and once you hegemonize that, you essentially become a caste in yourself. And then you want to retain that structure by claiming your natural right. White people don't have any natural right in America, but they established that. How did they do that? By really subordinating the quote, whatever natural laws they were, but by creating a substantiated caste structure to really create a limited autonomy within their own groups. And that's why we had so much of union and all other problems. And I think that's what I was trying to push through that. And yes, British are certainly to be blamed, but British were not alone. British were guided by the Brahmins, who were their servants or subordinates in the government. And so when we say British colonized, they didn't alone colonize. The Brahmins and the dominant caste Indians alongside them pimped the Indian nation to the exploitation of not only British, but also Mughals, but also the Turks who came and colonized us for so long.
Krish, I want to follow up with another question about the limits of the limits of collectivity or the possibilities of alliances. And this is a question that just popped up a moment ago. What are your thoughts on the co-option or the co-optation of liberal or feminist movements by upper caste? And how does this play in creating oppressive systems within these movements? And how must these movements transform to actually eradicate patriarchy and right-wing fascism?
I think, this response will also merit a little bit of non-vogue response from my side, and just kind of heads up on that front, because I think even the feminist angle that we see in contemporary times, especially I'm talking in this anti-caste movement, is very much rooted in, not the grassroots one, but the one you see in America, or the one you see directed by Open Foundation type of, or Ford Foundation type of projects, has a limited purpose. The idea of patriarchy and homophobia is a new concept for much of the, as a concept, not the system that has already been existing, but this modern concept of what we call Pitru Sattak, at least in Marathi. In Hindi, there must be something that Laura would know the word. And what this merits is, when we are taking on the idea of patriarchy, what are we replacing it with? Is it to do with another hegemony of castes? And this is what has happened by majority of the feminist movements in India. And unfortunately, too much of my dismay, they remain shameless, irrespective of the constant critiques done by Dalit feminists in their angle. That they continue to co-opt, and there is always a conscious attempt to remove and excuse their menfolk from the critique of feminism. So who are their targets when they talk about patriarchy? It's mostly vulnerable, poor, working class Dalits or lower caste Indians who really work on this space. There is no critique of what we always been talking about, the Brahminical patriarchy. The patriarchy that is sanctioned by Brahminism, the order that really subjugates and relegates the humanity of women to objects and animals, which is equivalent to Dalits. So these three remain common in common parlance for the caste edifice, the structure of Manusmriti, which was the law of land until 1950 in India for good 2,000 years. So this is why the co-optation might exist, but also my worry is, even if we address the co-optation, what are we going to replace that co-optation with? Do we have a solid framework, or is it just going to be, as I said, is it going to be one of those altering the faces and altering the names, but the critique of that system doesn't remain mainstream? And I think that's something we need to collectively answer.
I think, speaking of collectivity and kind of future-oriented work, there's a question from Maite Marciano. I love the idea of deciding a program of the future without cynicism, they write. What would these concrete programs look like, especially in the humanities? How can we imagine a humanities program that would embody the ideas of fellowship, sibling solidarity, and what would they look like?
I think we should teach, instead of teaching only comparative studies, we should go beyond comparative, and we should teach identical studies. Where are such identical forms of systems existing? And they do not have to always rely on comparisons. They can exist as a standalone on their own categories. And humanities have a huge role, and that's what I'm saying. I think art can be our guidance in this. Let artists take a chain of command for some time at least. Let the poets be the lawmakers of this new sense of curriculum. Maybe there is much more imagination that our social sciences or humanities might not have, but some of these kind of bordering disciplines might be able to help us think through. And in many ways, with the sibling solidarity that we are trying to advance, we are also we are conscious not to reproduce the patriarchy, the homophobia, the transphobia, ableism, the ideas of relegating someone just because they are not in a heteronormative in a heteronormative character. And I think for that to really happen, one of our responsibilities is to find identical, not twins. Again, I'm not saying we need to find A as to A. We don't have to find clones, and we don't want to create more clones, but to kind of imagining the originality in each own context and seeing what does the vulnerability of a Maori or a landless person in South Africa or Mexico or in Brazil, the Quilombola people living in or even the Amazonian people, with that of the Adivasis or Dalits in India or the African American Native Americans in America. There is something very common to them, which is for them to share the space with others. And sharing is something that goes beyond my need or your need. It's, I want to share with you because I believe in you. I believe in your equal self, as opposed to also not believing in my lesser self. And I think that's why I'm saying we need to find much more that can be shared. And that's the question that we'll probably answer about appropriation, about mishandling of these issues. And it's, again, if I'm coming to the table, I will not come empty-handed. I will come with a purpose of at least giving my, if I have two hands, I will lend one hand, and I will let one hand do something else for my, and I think if you're willing to work on that, then there is much more of a common project that we can design.
Speaking of sharing, I want to thank everyone for sharing their questions in the chat. Apparently there is a way to unmute, and so we have one person who is going to unmute their microphone and ask you a question directly, and they're up right now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is the first time I'm listening to you, Suraj, on live. It was lovely to listen to you and to know your knowledge. Thank you for sharing. I have like a two-part question. So when we talk about the book by Isabel Wilkerson, the immediate response from the oppressors is that you're trying to co-opt to the victimhood of racism. Is there a way to show them that we as brothers are in solidarity in this? Do you have any plans of writing a book or something like that? Any way that we can tell them we are in this together?
Thank you, Divya. Read the book one more time if you have not. I think many of the people who jump on, see, there is this enthusiasm of critiquing, right? And social media has amplified that space. If there is a criticism from one person, the other person wants to jump on because we just disagreed on some concepts. And I think we really need to be sincere reviewers, sincere critiques. That really means reading the book for what it is offering. Of course, then our opinions can follow on. Wilkerson has not at all claimed, at least in the reading I did, any appropriation of any cause. She is writing as an African American. Her audience is African American. And if we know her audience and her hypothesis, then we will not have much of these difficulties. Now, one thing I, of course, had my critique was the Jewish involvement in this. And I don't think that was her original plan. And she even mentioned that she eventually added. Now, that is an important proposition. But Jewish themselves have a caste system, not in the sense of how we see, but the priests, the Kohens, and of course the divide between Ashkenazis and the Arabian Jews. So there is a historic, and Jews have been themselves victims, of a caste system by also having their own, and there is actually a paper I was reading from 1940s or 50s about the Jewish question and caste. It's a fascinating read, and how it kind of amplifies as to how and Jewish special invest in India, who came and and they are still there in Konkan region mostly, we were existing. So in this case, I of course had my and I aired it in few discussions that the Jewish proposition in this case perhaps was a stretch, But her purpose in this case, if it was to talk about caste, the African American and Indian analogy fits perfectly well. Had she done perhaps more research on the Jewishness beyond the World War era victimization of Jews, there has also been victimization of Jews prior to that, which has a longer history, which has much more much more assaults committed on the Jewish community. So I think that part of history would perhaps have amplified that narrative. That didn't happen. But with context of her reading of the book and what we could do is perhaps work and here's the thing. I'm not encouraging you to disagree with the book. I'm really encouraging you to engage with the thesis of the book. And of course, there have been people who have been telling me her book is not anthropologically correct, and I'm like, she's never claiming she's writing an anthropological text. She is a storyteller. She tells stories so gripping that you want to see what happens next. And she is saying it in a way, and in many ways, she is resurrecting the history of African American freedom struggle that remained somehow obfuscated during the civil rights era, especially 1940s onwards. So she has done a great service, and she has put back again the African American global struggle that was already existing. And I think for 21st century, that could be one of the ways to engage with both geographies.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Also, how can we mobilize all the small and the large organizations in India and in diaspora for ourselves? How can we do that? Or how do you think we can do that?
Wow, let's do that. Divya, I think one of the ways we could do is, and I appreciate the call for action. You know what I mean? Like this is basically a success of a panel. Laura, Ivy, we are doing a good job here. People, I think what we should do is, I've been pushing for this. Let's organize youth conferences, youth exchanges. Let's get people from India, the Dalits, to come to US and take US youth, African Americans and people of colors to India, especially to the Dalit neighborhoods. And I've been pushing for this for so long. I was even pushing to the late Dr. John Lewis when he proposed the Gandhi King. There's legislation. I was like, you gotta put Dalits in somewhere. I think he couldn't do it, but he promised me. And if he was alive, maybe things would work out in a way. But we can work out on institutional level. So let's join hands and try to create a campus-based anti-caste movement. Students of Northwestern can start, like apartheid was started on campus from 1960s in UC Berkeley, anti-apartheid activism. Why not anti-caste activism become your struggle of our times? And that could go alongside demanding justice for the incarcerated, for the oppressed people belonging in your own country. Alongside that, if we cast a wider tent, that will be important. I mean, there was Angela Davis who worked through that broader framework, and there was internationalism of some sort. Now we really need to bring about that. So I think campus-based solidarity movements, kind of exchange of ideas. I'm organizing a international Dalit literary conference, hopefully next year, which will give you opportunity to meet many Dalit writers from across. We are trying to work out the venue and stuff like that, but that will be an opportunity for you to collaborate and work together.
Wow, that sounds all exciting, and I'm already pumped. Thank you.
We're closing on time here, and although the conversation has been very fluid and animated, and I'm loath to close it out, but on the question of alliance and sibling solidarity, there are a couple questions that have come up in the chat, and I'll just kind of render malleable a few of them together, and thinking about possibilities in the futures. And Suraj, how do you think like non-Dalits and non-upper caste folks should relate to one another? Like, and what is a context by which they could work together? What could be the difference between a kind of a logic of sympathy and a logic versus a kind of logic of empathy as a point of connection for Indians in the diaspora, for example?
That's right. I mean, in my book, my last chapter, I invite Brahmins to be cultural suicide bombers, and that's a proposition for dominant caste to redeem their humanity, if at all there is, and I believe there is. It's just been overshadowed by the bigotry of proving one's superiority over fictional faulty lines. And I wanna, anti-caste struggle needs to be everybody's struggle. There is no sanitizing, and there is no necessary involvement of hard test. It's just the real soulful investment in correcting something that you realize is wrong. And that correcting of wrong is very possible for you to realize your complicity in it. We are complicit in it. And once we realize there is much more your extension of attention and empathy can garner. Our experiences has been the dominant castes, non-Dalits, enter our space and waste our time. They just talk about what they think is right, as opposed to listening to our prescriptions of what should be done. And so I want, as I've always said, we want the servants of the movement who are from the dominant caste. They need to learn to humble themselves and live as subordinates to the cause, not subordinates to any human beings or any individuals. And once you learn how to be subservient to larger cause, maybe there is much more chance for your empathy to take shape. Many times I tell them, the Brahmins need to fight against their own brothers and sisters, their own parents, their own uncles and aunties and relatives, their own structure. The dominant caste need to do the same. That is very well possible. And that's your own ambit. Now, if you think that struggle is difficult, then you have no business to come and work and occupy the space that I'm already holding with much difficulty. I would rather expect an army of anti-caste Brahmins fighting against casteist bigoted Brahmins who are working parallelly. We can share notes and eventually become part of one. The goal is for us to become part of this whole one. And that will only happen once I see that you are blowing your cultural privileges in the service of anti-caste struggle. Till then, you will have to keep trying and testing your humanity if there is some patience in it.
I see lots of hands thrown up in the emoji column and lots of fires here. For my part, I can only say thank you for such an animating conversation. It was both enlightening, but also generous in that shared vision of a sibling solidarity. I'll let Laura close out, but I do want to say thank you to everyone here who participated in the chat and listened, and also acknowledge that one of the members of the steering committee, Emily McGuire, joined us today, and thank my other colleagues at Northwestern for helping host this event. So Laura?
Yeah, I'm just waving. Emily's waving, so I wanted to wave back.
Yeah, we're all waving. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Suraj, this was extraordinary, and I want to thank you for your generosity of spirit and time and amazing intellectual resources, and to listen to you and to watch this conversation going on in the chat and all of the love that was passing between everybody here. It was really, really great. And you definitely have secured your invitation back as soon as we can possibly get you. So I know you're insanely busy and much in demand, and I'm thrilled that you took the time to speak with us today. And I want to thank everyone who's here for listening and for asking such great questions. And thanks to Ivy for contributing and partnering with me on this. And this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come. So thank you so much.
I want to thank your excellent students for their enthusiasm
yes.
and investment. Gratitude to them.
Great. All right. Well, I don't want to say goodbye, but I guess that's it, right?
Thank you for everyone for holding space together here.
Thank you so much.